Hello and welcome to Written Words. I'm Helen and my inspiration for today's video has come from this book. This book is by Thomas Miller and it's called Our Old Town and it was published in 1857. It describes ordinary everyday life in Miller's hometown in the first half of the 19th century. So in terms of this particular town, that means before the railways arrived and before industry arrived in the town. This is how he describes the town in his introduction to the book. Our old town is a strange, rambling, twisty, dreamy-looking place. Portions of it are very ancient, and the principal streets are built in the form of a cross, a sure sign of great antiquity. A beautiful navigable river flows beside it, and runs for miles through a rich pastoral country, then empties itself into an arm of the sea. Behind, it is hemmed in by green, breezy hills, looking as if, undated centuries ago, its first inhabitants had erected their huts at the foot of the hills for shelter while they pastured their flocks in the valley. Throughout the whole book, Miller does not once mention the name of the town, or this navigable river, or indeed any of the other villages and towns in the nearby vicinity. But anyone who knows the town of Gainsborough in Lincolnshire in the UK may very well recognise it from his descriptions. So in this video, we're going to take a little walk through present-day Gainsborough, but guided by Miller. And we'll see what has changed since Miller's day and what is still the same in the town. One of the town's most important features is the River Trent, which at the time when the book was written was a major source of transport for people and goods coming in and out of the town. So shipping at that time was a very important part of town life, and ships and other boats were a normal sight on the river. And because of that, the river bank was lined with wharves and staiths where passengers and goods were loaded and unloaded. Here's a little passage from Miller describing what it was like down at the staiths. These town staiths had been free from time immemorial, and there were neither wharfage dues nor tolls of any kind paid on the goods delivered at these ancient landing places. To the broad staith steps our townspeople came with their pails and jugs for water, and those who had to take it far placed a strong wooden hoop on the half of each pail, which enabled them, when standing inside of it, to keep the two buckets a good distance apart, and carry the heavy load much further and with greater ease than they could have done without the hoop. It was amazing to see what little youths and maidens were enabled to carry off their two heavy buckets of water by such means. Rare courting places were these old staiths. Time out of mind they had been the meeting places for the young of both sexes, for the pretty servant maids came thither for water, and but seldom, I believe, without first having a good look at themselves in the glass to see how this tempting little collar or that neat little cap sat, or how becomingly those carefully tended ringlets fell, heartbreakers as they used to be called by the old-fashioned people in our old town. Although in the 21st century ships are now a rare sight on the River Trent, there is still evidence of the wharves and the staiths if you take a walk along the now reinforced embankment. In the book, Miller talks a lot about the marketplace, which was the centre of activity in the town. The marketplace is still used for the twice-weekly market, and many of the buildings around the market square do resemble the descriptions that Miller puts in his book. There are, of course, no live animals in the market now, and goods tend to be delivered by road rather than by ship or by horse and cart. But the sturdy stalls that he mentions are still put out before every market day and then taken away again at the end of the day. Once a week, our old town was aroused from its dreamy stupor by the bleating and lowing of flocks and herds, the rumble of carriers' carts and wagons, the tramp of mounted horsemen, the arrival of boats from riverside villages, and all the stir and tumult caused by market day. Long before daylight, excepting in the summer months, Men were busy in carrying out and putting up stalls, and solid structures many of them were, especially those used by the butchers, each strong straddling trestle of which was a load, while the stall planks were 2 inches thick and scraped every time as clean as sharp knives could make them, until they almost looked snowy white beneath the dark, heavy, overhanging tarry tilts. The wind might blow and the rain beat, it could never overturn those massy trestles, nor penetrate those tar-steeped awnings. I had the opportunity earlier this year to run a stall in that very market when the town had its Wordfest back in September. The marketplace is still an important part of the town, and at the moment it is undergoing some substantial renovation, so hopefully this will restore it to its former glory in the coming months. One passage that I particularly enjoyed was Miller's description of the lamplighter, who went around every evening lighting all the street lamps. The big-bellied lamps, with their red conical tops, which the lame lamplighter put on his head while rubbing the glass round with a handful of tow, were more in keeping with our ancient streets and gable-ended houses, whose overhanging windows were on a level with the iron scroll-work in which the lamps were sunk, and caught on their diamond-shaped lead-enclosed panes, and in their deep-bayed and shadowy recesses fitful glimmerings and bright dots of dusty splendour from the red smoky flames. Of course, in the age of electricity, we no longer have a need for street lamp lighters, but many of the modern electric lamps are still in keeping with the old-fashioned style. Miller's description of the old waterworks is a rather grim one. By the riverside stood the old waterworks. A stranger, in passing that dark, wet, steep, slippery entry, might have paused for a moment to have wondered what it was that made such a low, rumbling, creaking sound. Had he gone a yard or two down and peeped into the dim, low doorway under the vaulted passage, he would have seen through the half-darkened cellar-like light a poor weary horse going round and round, turning a large, strong, horizontal wooden wheel, on which some young urchin would be seated with a whip in his hand, quite enjoying the ride. From the pursing up of the little driver's lips, the looker-on would rightly conclude that he was whistling, though not a note could be heard for the groaning and moaning and shaking and quaking of the old heavy machinery. The old wheels seemed to groan again to be released, and the poor horse to stop every now and then to be lashed, as if flogging were really a relaxation compared to turning that useless multiplicity of ponderous wheels and straining under such a moving weight of crushing timber, which seemed only placed there to kill the poor horses. Again, we no longer have a need for a horse and a boy to pump the water into the town's homes, and the waterworks is long gone, but its memory lives on in the name of the street where it once stood. There was a workhouse in the town at that time, and Miller mentions it in passing. It was clearly not a nice place, because whenever a child found itself orphaned, according to Miller, the neighbours had a tendency to rally together and take the child into their own homes to save them from being sent to the workhouse. Then the overseers, unasked, would call from time to time and see that the orphans were well supplied with clothes and that they did not want for anything. Had they breathed a word about putting the children into the workhouse, that little yard would have been too hot for them to have breathed in long. They might almost as well have thrust their heads into the fiery wasp's nest, for every neighbour would have rushed out with her burning tongue and boiling kettle, had what they considered such an insult been offered to the orphans they had adopted as their own. A supermarket now stands on the site of the former workhouse, but the workhouse is remembered in the name of the local drama group. Miller makes frequent reference to yards and twitchels or alleyways, a cut-through between buildings or streets. As a picture of the past, and one that had never been altered for many long years, I shall now endeavour to bring before the eye the trades and shops, odd characters and old houses, ancient lanes, yards and twitchels, in some other such order as they stood, and with the old names by which the trades were called. For a long way up the principal street, nearly all the shops fronted the river, the street dividing them from the wharves and warehouses opposite. And strange-looking places were some of those passages and lanes and staithes which led under and beside the warehouses to the river. Some of these twitchels and alleyways and yards are long gone, of course, but many of them still remain and are still in use by residents of the town. At the very heart of the town and very near the marketplace, in Miller's time and today, are two key buildings, the church and the Old Hall. The church has been altered since Miller's time, but it is still the same building that he would have seen when he lived in the town. And the old church. The first thing that struck you on entering it was the large royal arms above your head, over which was written, in letters of gold, "Honour the King." You looked higher and saw the flags of the volunteers drooping above your head and covered with dust. They had hung there ever since Prince Charlie came over the water, tattered relics of the would-have-been defenders of our old town, if the Pretender had approached that old-fashioned place, which he did not, although he came within very few miles of it. There were long sloping galleries on each side, abutting on massy pillars crowned with Corinthian capitals, and which had a grand, gloomy look. Green curtains could be drawn to keep out the sun. The pulpit, which stood very near the centre of the church, had cushions covered with crimson velvet, edged with gold. These trappings were the gift of an old general who was buried in the churchyard, the spoil won in some battle at which he had fought. The old clerk's large folio prayer book was thumbed to bits. Half of many of the pages were worn away, but he knew the whole service by rote, and he had no use for the book. He had a fine voice, and there was a peculiar thrill in his "Amen" that made the old church ring again. It reminded you of the fall of Corporal Trim's hat. It went to the heart. The building which we now call the Old Hall was called the Old Hall even in Miller's time, because it is indeed very, very old. It's a medieval hall, but it's built on the site of an earlier castle. On the site of the Old Hall, which that ancient church tower overtops, stood the Mercian Castle, in which a Danish king died, and tradition says that a Saxon church then stood where the tower is now standing 1250 years ago. As for the Old Hall itself, it seems to have fallen into disrepair during Miller's time. Here is his description of it. The Old Hall was a huge, dilapidated building, forming three sides of a square. One, if not both the wings, had been added within the last 250 years. Portions of the centre that faced the moat behind were considerably older. It had been let off for a long time in separate rooms for shops and dwelling places, to the great disgrace of the owner, for it was one of the finest old baronial mansions that could be found within many miles of this old-fashioned town. But excepting the walls and a few architectural ornaments, both within and without, there was but little left to proclaim its former grandeur beyond its massiveness and the immense space of ground it covered. And like many old buildings, the Old Hall certainly has its share of ghost stories attached to it. Whoever yet knew an ancient building without its ghost and buried pots of gold? Anybody about the Old Hall would tell you of the young painter who was at work inside and who was picked up senseless with the paintbrush in his hand, who for days after could only exclaim, "She is there! There she is!" and who, when he was restored, told a tale of the lady in white who appeared to him and beckoned him to follow. Smiling at first, then looking angry because he did not obey, and he knew no more. Instead of 12 o'clock at night, however, the general hour when ghosts most do congregate, this white lady of the hall chose to make her appearance at 12 o'clock in the day. Fortunately, recent owners have lovingly restored the Old Hall to its former glory. It's now managed by English Heritage and it's open to visitors. The River Trent being tidal means it is prone to flooding, and Miller makes an interesting observation about the location of the nearby villages. In one direction, I found all the villages either standing on the summits, on the sides, or at the foot of the hills, and not any by the borders of the river, but often separated from them by rich marshes a mile or two in breadth. This seemed at first at variance with the records of antiquity, as in the early ages the first settlers in a country reared their habitations and pastured their flocks beside the watercourses. And as all the churches in these low-lying villages were very old, they were a proof that there the residences of the first inhabitants had been erected in very remote times. I, however, soon discovered that during high tides, or after a long continuance of rain, and always at some time or another during the winter, these immense marshes, which furnished such rich pasturage for cattle in summer, were flooded, and very often remained under water for several weeks. This accounted for these old villages standing so far removed from the river, and also showed that for centuries the face of the country had undergone no change. Flooding is still commonplace in the 21st century in this particular area, although the town itself is now protected by concrete flood defences. There was a particularly large flood earlier this year which left the nearby fields underwater for several weeks and also caused the police to close the road bridge for several days, causing many problems for local motorists. Of course, the most important part of any town is the people in it, and Miller includes a multitude of anecdotes about the various different characters that lived in the town when he lived there. So here are just a few. There is the fortune teller, old Pinky, friend John, poor old Joe, long Tommy, the chimney sweep, the miller, the tailor, the doctor, the lawyer, the vicar, the curate, and many, many more. One particularly colourful character is Miss Etherington, a milliner who took young ladies under her wing for training. And Miss Etherington, the head milliner in our town, always called those who came to her for instructions her young ladies, and they in return always called her Miss Etherington. But oh, she was such an old woman to be called Miss. Mother would have seemed a better word, for the juvenile airs she assumed, such as trying to trip out of the back room into the shop whenever a gentleman called, only made her young ladies laugh behind her back, while she herself appeared ridiculous in spite of her false teeth and false curls. I believe many of her young ladies came solely to get sweethearts and husbands, and that learning the millinery business was only an excuse for leaving the large lonely farmhouses and spending a few months in our old town, for they were generally very pretty, and all the young clerks aspired to the hands of Miss Etherington's young ladies. There is still an Etherington Street in the town today. I don't know whether there is any connection with this Miss Etherington, the milliner, or not, but I will certainly spare a thought for her and her young ladies every time I pass by. As I walked into the churchyard, I noticed quite a number of the headstones remembered people who would have been alive in the town at the time that Miller was living here. Miller uses very few real names for his characters in the book, so could any of these people be some of the characters remembered in the book? Miller ends his book by mentioning Shakespeare and Ben Jonson. Apparently, according to Miller, Shakespeare described one of the nearby villages. One of the most minute descriptions of actual scenery in the whole of Shakespeare's immortal writings has reference to a well-known spot that lies within 3 miles of this old-fashioned town. He has preserved the very name of the little village, and which is still retained by the half-dozen old cottages that remain. How he obtained his information and described the spot so minutely, unless by visiting it himself, is difficult to conceive, for the peculiarity of the scenery, which he has delineated so truthfully, is not, to my knowledge, even alluded to in any work which has come under my own observation, that was printed so far back as the time of James I. So was Shakespeare himself in the area at some point? Who knows? Unfortunately, Miller doesn't mention the name of the village, and I have been unable so far to discover its identity, But if anyone out there knows any more about this, please do let me know. So how much has changed in our old town since Miller's time? Needless to say, the advent of the railway and the motor car meant the decline of shipping. Although many of the buildings along the riverbank which would have been connected with shipping have been preserved and converted into flats and businesses. The town's boundaries have expanded since Miller's time with the arrival of industry, in particular Marshall's Yard, where agricultural machinery was manufactured. However, agriculture is still an important part of the region, and the town is surrounded by miles upon miles of farmland. And because of that, the town's character has changed much less than some other places in Britain in that time. I can still imagine many of Miller's characters frequenting the marketplace, the shops and the pubs of the town. They may be wearing 21st century clothing, but the people of the town still enjoy some of the simpler things in life: friends and family, conversation, and a good meal at the end of a hard day's work. Not to mention walks along the riverbank. So if you ever find yourself in Gainsborough, do take a walk in Thomas Miller's footsteps. Gainsborough Heritage Centre is a good place to start, and they even have a small display on the works of Thomas Miller. You can also download an interesting walking tour from the council website, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. So to finish off, here's a little writing prompt. Our Old Town is a book of just over 300 pages about a specific town, but never once does the author mention the name of that town or its river or any of the neighbouring towns and villages. Can you write a short piece about the place where you live, describing the place itself and how the people live there, but without mentioning any names? Thank you very much for joining me on my little walk around Gainsborough, and I hope you enjoyed Miller's descriptions along the way. In my next video, I'm also going to be visiting a place with very interesting literary connections, a couple of hours drive away from today's walk. So I hope you'll join me for that one, and in the meantime, happy reading and happy writing.